Welcome back. With growing calls for systemic change, it's essential to explore innovative solutions that address the deep rooted issues within our law's enforcement system. The Center for Policing Equity is at the forefront of this movement. Their mission is to protect, empower, and support vulnerable communities, particularly Black and Brown communities, by redesigning public safety systems. Here now is the Senior Vice President of Justice Partnerships at the Center for Policing Equity, Eric Cumberbatch. Eric, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Now, can you elaborate on the mission of the Center for Policing Equity and how it aims to redesign public safety systems?
Sure, simply put, I would say our mission is really framed around Black liberation. At the forefront, we know that there's legacies of white supremacy across all systems that are built to protect and serve Black people. And for us, we have a keen focus on legislation and law enforcement, and how do we remove the harms that we see done to Black and Brown people on a daily basis through these structures that weren't built for us and weren't built by us. And we look at legislation as the tool for us to really break down barriers and silos. We seek to empower community members to be at the forefront of designing policy, and we look at policy as the tool to actually mold and shape legislation. We dive deep into science, ensuring that our policy is steeped in best practices, supported by evidence, and really driving towards what the data shows us, um, so that we can, really move towards real equity, genuine equity, through a public health lens.
Now, how does CPE approach the task of redesigning public safety systems to be less racist, less deadly, and less omnipresent?
Again, it's looking at what the data shows us and what the lived experience of people are actually telling us. What we know is that there's alternatives to law enforcement, and law enforcement has been the tool that's been given to Black and Brown people to solve very complex social service issues, mental health issues, economic issues, you name it, all of the social determinants of health. But the sole tool that's been given is law enforcement. So this isn't, rocket science or creating something that is so nuanced and brilliant. It's actually believing in the strength of people, believing in the strength of community, empowering and lifting up the solutions that we know actually work, and have been intentionally held back um, for a certain population, and that population being folks that look like me and you.
Now, what are some successful examples of redesigned public safety systems that CPE has been involved with?
So we've been major players across the entire terrain of looking at legislative policies that are backed by science, that reduce the footprint of law enforcement, really looking at traffic legislation to end low level stops. Why do we need people with a gun and a taser and a baton to when a pencil and paper is needed to write a traffic ticket? Why do we need armed personnel showing up to a person's home while they're enduring a mental health crisis? All of these things. So really looking at how do we go further upstream, but we've been really successful in the traffic space, ending low level stops, pushing legislation, whether that's in New York around data transparency, pushing legislation in California, Connecticut, Washington around low level stops, working with law enforcement agencies to really take deep dives and have a better understanding of what their community members are actually enduring, and then putting out a lot of policy stances and white paper briefs that really articulate what redesign can look like. I think people call for what they know, and what they know is law enforcement because that's what they've been given. So really broadening the capacity and capabilities of, what is actually out there. What can we do that makes everybody safer, both law enforcement and community members, but especially removing the harm that is done when we have an over reliance on law enforcement, punitive and punishment systems.
Now, this is a nationwide issue. Are there any challenges when addressing something that is on a much bigger scale? So we're not just talking, New York or another state. This is happening nationwide. What are some challenges that come with that? And alternatively, could it be easier if it's nationwide? That means just because that means everybody is kind of focusing on the issue. Can you give us a little bit of insight and kind of, what your experience has been addressing that?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. The complexity and challenge nationwide is that you're dealing you're operating on a federal level, and what we've seen, folks are social media savvy and watching the news and so forth. There's not a lot of change that's happening on that level, as when compared to local level change. So local level is extremely important. And as we're working in a national capacity, diving into localities, municipalities, cities, so forth, to really change legislation in those spaces. We've been extremely helpful and beneficial to help stand up, whether that's proposals from different city council members, senators, mayors, supporting individuals in all of those platforms, um, with the policies that they should be calling for, um, and really giving people the backbone to be bold and radical in change and redesign. So I think the challenge is getting to federal policy, because federal policy does set both the floor and the ceiling, but the in between happens at the local level. And right now, there's a great deal of change happening at the local level.
Now, I want to move on to the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. This was a significant piece of legislation that CPE supported. Can you discuss the impact of this act and the role CPE played in its development?
Well, again, I think it's extremely powerful and important for the Center for Policing and Equity to show up in these spaces as genuine experts, and not only genuine experts from an academics or um, policing angle, but a genuine expertise that this is a black led, black founded, and black leadership across this organization. So our lived experience, our heartfelt experience, coupled with data, coupled with science, we're one of the few organizations with this skill set, this capacity, this amount of diversity, which bridges the gap from abolitionists to academics to former police chiefs, all in one space, driving what policies could look like, what policies should look like. So we have expertise across just a number of domains. And for us, really pouring into data transparency, calling for bans on what we know cause harm, um, actions that cause harm, rather. All of these things that we're pouring our heart, soul, mind, and spirit into, to really create change, and stimulate what possibilities can be, what the future can look like if we stop this heavy presence and over reliance on law enforcement.
Now, can you talk about the importance of addressing racism as a public health issue?
Yeah, I think as a public health issue, if we look at things through an ecological model lens, then we start to see that we can't focus in on just one aspect when we're talking about white supremacy or racism. We have to look at the entire ecosystem and really dive into how we're undoing these legacies, these harmful legacies, on the individual level, the institutional level, cultural level, political level, really engaging simultaneously in all of these issue areas, so that we could really unpack, create change, and codify what change looks like. Oftentimes, we'll see a good police chief, and people will point to that good police chief, or we'll see a certain politician, but those people come and go, and they leave. But how do we create systems that are sustainable, that last, and really serve people with real intention? And for me, it's extremely important for us to be the creators and designers of our future, us being Black people.
And that's a really great point. I'm so glad that you mentioned that although there may be amazing people within these oppressive systems, they're not going to be there forever and the system will still remain. So I think that's an amazing point that you brought up. Thank you for that. Now, community engagement is a critical part of CPE's work. How does CPE ensure that the voices of Black and Brown communities are amplified and incorporated into its initiatives?
Yeah, so beyond voice, community agency has to be lifted up. So we don't show up in a paternalistic fashion and say, this is what must happen, this is what you should do. We show up with a great deal of humility, and we want to listen, we want to understand, and we want to invest in the champions, the experts, and the expertise that's on the ground. We understand that the brilliance is in the lived experience. For us, it's how do we listen? How do we unpack what we're hearing and build tools that actually support people? We give those tools back to people, tools that could be, let's say, policy stances that will then support legislation, support community empowerment, coalition building, tools that may give toolkits as to what they could be calling for in different spaces at community boards or council hearings and meetings and so forth. I mean, ultimately, the general public is left unequipped to go into many spaces, and what we want to do is make sure that they have the right tools for advocacy, the right education, and an asset and a resource and an ally within our organization.
Can you tell me more about the Community Up program and its impact on grassroots public safety efforts?
Yeah, so Community Up is amazing. Oftentimes, the organization would show up under uh, or from a law enforcement call. Law enforcement agencies seeking to partner with us, and one of the major things I wanted to do when I got here was shift that framing. And we have brilliant leaders on our community engagement team. So many, I don't want to name them. I'll get in trouble if I do that and miss somebody, but just brilliant individuals that are showing up to support community members on their initiatives, and how communities want to build public safety from a public health lens that are community led and driven, but oftentimes need the support, the infrastructure, and the legitimacy in the science that exists that supports and backs that.
Now, how does CPE collaborate with law enforcement agencies to implement policy recommendations?
Yeah, so it's really difficult to um, the policy space and law enforcement together is huge, but it's a very difficult space to generate um, the type of policies that we want to see right here, right now. So a lot of the work with law enforcement agencies is around harm reduction, knowing that where our intent is to shrink the footprint of the law enforcement agency, but we can't do that overnight. So the policies and the practices, procedures that we're moving are more so ones that aim to put us on a trajectory that lessens um, where law enforcement is needed and how law enforcement is used. And I'll go back to what I first opened up around mental health and traffic and all of these other areas. We shouldn't be policed because of poverty. We should be undoing what is causing poverty. We shouldn't be policed because of homelessness. We should be focused on securing homes for unhoused people. So, what seems very logical, law enforcement has been the tool that's used to uh, solve many complex issues that are have been purposely government sponsored, man made issues in the Black community.
Now, can you tell me about the Unlocking Democracy program?
Yeah, so unlocking democracy is amazing. This is like a centralized hub that brings local level elected officials, community members, directors of CBOs all together in one space. And ideally, this is how do we generate and cultivate new ideas? How do we bring expertise in certain areas of work, let's say violence interruption? How do we help communities actually learn that they themselves play the biggest role in public safety and that they could stand up and implement these types of programs and approaches? And then how do we give legislators the tools necessary to actually legislate and fund these types of activities? So, it's extremely beneficial and a critical component to empowering community members to be at the forefront of driving what public safety is and equipping elected leaders with the tools and the supports to actually be bold in the space.
What can people listening or people who will, eventually see this do now to support your efforts?
Donate. No, what I would say is to be active. I think we have to be active, and activism looks different for many people and shows up in many spaces. But for us to be active in all of these spaces and understand that we're on a journey, this is a continuum. We may not see the fruits of our labor in our lifetime, but we are definitely setting the foundation for the future of Black and Brown people, and we have to be active in that. We can't be passive.
Eric, I want to thank you so much for, having this discussion. It's a really important one, and I think that we are now in a time where we are a little bit more open to having the discussion, but so much more work is needed, to kind of achieve that goal. Can you quickly just let me know what's your vision for the future of public safety in the United States?
Uh, a, a, a diminished look of law enforcement and punitive justice systems, and over reliance on upstream root cause issues, invested by public health solutions and steeped in public health frameworks, so that we have healthy people, healthy communities, and healthy institutions, and therefore we'll see healthier outcomes.
That was amazing. Once again, thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation.
Thank you all. I appreciate you. Keep doing the dope work.
Thank you. We have to
All
take a
right.
quick break. We'll be back right after this.